Silence changes everything in a room. It shifts the atmosphere without warning. It feels heavier than words, louder than arguments, and far more final than emotions ever spoken out loud. Most people think an empath leaving looks emotional, crying, begging, explaining, trying one more time to fix something already falling apart. But reality feels far more unsettling. When an empath finally goes quiet, that moment signals the ending long before anyone notices. Their silence never arrives early. It arrives last. This video reveals the hidden emotional process behind an empath's withdrawal. The unseen stages that lead from deep connection to complete emotional distance. You will see how repeated emotional strain slowly reshapes warmth into exhaustion, and how constant misunderstanding turns expression into silence. These patterns explain why some connections collapse without warning, leaving confusion on one side and relief on the other. Nothing about this shift is sudden. Everything builds quietly beneath the surface, long before the silence appears. Each stage uncovers a truth most people miss. Empathy without reciprocity turns into quiet disappearance. A gentle heart does not stop caring overnight. It simply reaches a point where being understood feels impossible and being heard feels pointless. Stay until the end to understand the final shift that turns emotional presence into permanent distance. Welcome to Empath Energy. Subscribe for more deep insights into emotional psychology and human behavior. There is a moment most people completely miss. The moment an empath starts running out of energy, long before they ever walk away. It never looks like leaving at first. It looks like effort. More messages, more explanations, more patience than should realistically exist in one person. They do not disappear. They try harder. Empaths rarely step out of a connection without warning. Instead, they speak over and over again. They try to translate their emotions into words that finally make sense to the other person. They explain what hurts. They point out what is breaking them. They try to make the invisible visible. And when that doesn't work, they adjust themselves. They soften their tone. They lower their expectations. They forgive what they swore hurt too much to forgive. Not once, not twice, but again and again. Second chances are not rare for an empath. They are normal. Third chances are not unusual. Sometimes there are so many chances given that the empath themselves forget what they originally needed in return, because their instinct is not to leave. Their instinct is to repair, to understand, to hold things together even when they are the only ones holding. But something quiet starts happening in the background. Every unacknowledged feeling takes a piece of their voice. Every dismissed concern takes a piece of their patience. Every ignored boundary takes a piece of their willingness to keep explaining, until explaining starts to feel like speaking into a wall that never responds, and that is where the shift begins. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in exhaustion that slowly turns communication into silence. And then something shifts that most people completely misread. The silence begins, and from the outside it can look like coldness, distance, even anger, but inside it is something far more fragile. It is not that the empath suddenly stops caring, it is that caring starts to hurt more than it helps. Their nervous system becomes overwhelmed from carrying emotions that were never fully received. Their heart grows tired from repeating the same truth into situations that refuse to change. And slowly they stop reacting, because reacting no longer feels safe or meaningful. Silence becomes protection, not punishment. At this stage, the empath begins to see clearly what was once blurred by hope. The kindness they gave so freely starts to feel unnoticed, even expected. They realize they have been pouring emotional energy into spaces that only value their presence when it is convenient, and something inside them quietly changes. The explanations that once came naturally start to fade. Not because they have nothing left to say, but because they are no longer sure anyone is truly listening. There is a silent grieving that begins long before anyone realizes the relationship is ending. They start mourning what they hoped it would become while still standing inside what it actually is. Their energy shifts before their words ever do. The warmth, the excitement, the emotional openness slowly disappears, replaced by a calm distance that feels unfamiliar even to them. And in that distance comes an uncomfortable truth. They are emotionally alone, even when they are not physically alone. They have been showing up for everyone else while slowly disappearing within themselves. That realization changes everything. Because at some point, silence stops being something that happens to them and becomes something they choose for themselves. Not out of revenge, not out of bitterness, but out of exhaustion so deep it turns into clarity. And once that clarity arrives, the detachment becomes steady, quiet, and difficult to reverse because the empath is no longer trying to be understood by people who only learned how to hear them when they were already gone. There comes a moment when everything an empath has been giving so freely starts to look different through tired eyes. Not because their kindness has changed, but because their awareness finally has. They begin to notice patterns they once ignored. The way they are only reached out to when someone needs comfort. The way their presence is valued most when things are falling apart for others, but rarely when things are calm. Empaths naturally give emotional energy without keeping score. They listen when others speak. They hold space when others break. They forgive when others fail. It is not something they think about. It is who they are. But over time, something quiet begins to surface beneath all that giving. A slow realization that they are consistently showing up for people who only recognize their value when it benefits them. At first they dismiss it. They tell themselves it is love, it is loyalty, it is understanding. But repetition reveals truth, and truth becomes harder to ignore when it keeps showing up in the same form again and again. Conversations become one-sided. Emotional effort becomes unbalanced. Their own needs are pushed further down while everyone else's needs are placed at the center, and slowly something inside them starts to shift. Not dramatically, not loudly, but deeply. They begin to question why their kindness feels so heavy instead of fulfilling, why giving so much leaves them feeling unseen instead of connected, why they are always the one holding things together but rarely the one being held. This realization does not make them colder, it makes them awake. It changes the way they see every interaction, every effort, every silence that was never returned with understanding. And once they see it clearly, they cannot unsee it, because now they understand that being kind is not the problem. Being taken for granted while being kind is. The most dangerous shift does not happen when emotions are loud. It happens when they go quiet. As long as an empath is still explaining, still trying, still finding new ways to express what hurts, there is still emotional attachment holding everything together. Even frustration carries connection. Even arguments carry hope. Because explaining means they still believe understanding is possible. But there is a point where something inside them changes direction. They stop searching for the right words. They stop revisiting the same conversations. They stop trying to make someone feel what they already expressed 100 different ways. Not because the pain disappeared, but because the effort no longer feels worth it. And that is where detachment begins. It is not a sudden decision, it is a quiet withdrawal that happens in layers. First, the explanations become shorter, then they become rare, then they stop altogether. What used to feel urgent now feels unnecessary. What used to demand clarity now meets silence instead. To the outside world, nothing may look different at first. They still respond, they still show up, but something essential is missing from their presence. The emotional investment is no longer flowing outward. It is slowly turning inward. This is the point where the empath begins to separate feeling from effort. They still care, but they are no longer trying to fix what keeps breaking in the same way. They stop carrying emotional responsibility for someone else's understanding. And in that space, silence starts to grow, not as punishment, but as distance forming between what they once hoped for and what they now accept. Because once explaining stops, connection does not immediately end. It slowly dissolves, quietly, without announcement. Until one day, the empath is no longer trying to be understood at all. One of the quietest heartbreaks an empath ever experiences is one that no one around them notices. While everything may still look normal on the surface, Something deeper is already ending inside them. They begin to grieve long before any physical distance is created, long before any goodbye is spoken, long before anyone realizes the connection is fading. Empaths do not always leave at the moment things fall apart. They leave emotionally first, in stages that are invisible to others. They replay moments in their mind, not to hold on to hope, but to understand where things started to change. They sit with disappointment in silence, trying to make sense of what they once believed would last. This is why their silence feels different. It is not empty. It is full of memory, reflection, and emotional processing that has already been happening for a long time. By the time they finally step away physically, their heart has already walked through every stage of goodbye. The confusion, the hope, the disappointment, the acceptance, all of it has already been lived internally. What people often mistake for sudden distance is actually the end of a long emotional journey that no one else witnessed. The empath may still be present in the room, still responding, still smiling when needed, but internally they are already closing chapters that once meant everything to them. And in that space, silence becomes something much deeper. It becomes the beginning of an internal farewell. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady emotional withdrawal that slowly prepares them for absence without needing permission or explanation. Because for an empath, leaving is rarely an action. It is a process of grieving what once mattered deeply until holding on no longer feels possible or honest. There is a turning point in every empath's emotional journey where their vision of people begins to change. For a long time, they see through softness. They see intention instead of behavior. They see potential instead of patterns. They believe in who someone could become more than who they consistently are. And that belief keeps them attached far longer than it should. Empaths are deeply wired to understand pain, which is why they often excuse behavior that others would question immediately. They see the wounds behind actions. They see the story behind mistakes. And in doing so, they sometimes overlook the very signs that are meant to protect them. Red flags do not always scare them away. Sometimes they reinterpret them through compassion. But repetition has a way of dissolving illusion. When the same emotional cycles repeat without change, something inside them starts to shift. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a fog lifting. They begin to notice consistency where they once saw exceptions. They begin to see patterns where they once saw misunderstandings. And slowly, the emotional lens of hope is replaced with something far more grounded. This shift is not bitterness, it is clarity. They are no longer asking, who could this person become? Instead, they begin asking, who have they consistently been? And that question changes everything. Because once an empath starts recognizing patterns instead of potential, emotional decisions become less confusing. Excuses lose their weight. Repeated behavior becomes impossible to ignore. They stop rewriting the same story with different expectations. And in that clarity, something powerful happens. The emotional grip begins to loosen. Not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started seeing without distortion. And once clarity replaces illusion, the way they connect with people can never return to what it once was. Long before an empath ever says a word about leaving, something quiet begins to shift in the way they exist around people. It is not a dramatic change. It is subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. But for those who were once close to them, the difference is there. Their warmth starts to fade in small moments. The energy that once felt open and inviting becomes reserved. Conversations that used to feel alive begin to feel lighter, shorter, less emotionally engaged. The spark that once came so naturally starts to disappear without explanation. It is not that they are trying to withdraw, it is that something inside them no longer responds the same way. The emotional effort that once flowed freely now feels distant, like something they have to reach for instead of something that comes naturally. And so, they begin to conserve themselves without even consciously deciding to. They are still present, still showing up, still participating when needed. But emotionally, they are no longer fully there. Part of them has already started stepping back, observing instead of engaging, feeling less instead of absorbing everything around them. This is where the disconnect becomes most confusing for others. Because nothing has been officially said, yet everything feels different. The energy has changed before the words have. The connection feels thinner even though the structure is still standing. And for the empath, this phase is not about punishment or reaction, it is about internal withdrawal, a slow release of emotional attachment that no longer feels safe to hold fully. They begin to exist in a space where they are no longer investing in what they are slowly preparing to step away from. Because by the time their words finally change, their energy has already made the decision long before. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from conflict, but from absence. From giving so much emotionally, yet feeling like no one is truly meeting them in the same space. For an empath, this becomes one of the quietest and most painful realizations they carry. They are often the ones others turn to first, the listener, the comfort, the steady presence during chaos. But in return, when they need the same emotional depth, the response is often inconsistent, limited, or completely absent. And over time, that imbalance starts to weigh heavily on their inner world. It is not that they expect perfection. They do not ask for constant reassurance or endless attention. What they long for is simple presence, emotional honesty, a feeling of being seen in the same way they see others. But when that is missing for too long, something begins to shift inside them. A quiet sentence starts forming in their mind, unspoken but deeply felt. A realization that echoes in their solitude. I am always there for everyone, but nobody is truly there for me. And that realization changes the way they show up. They start to pull back emotionally, not out of anger but out of fatigue. The constant effort of being emotionally available without receiving the same depth in return slowly drains their willingness to stay fully open. They begin to conserve their energy, choosing silence over explanation more often. Even their presence starts to feel different. Less giving, less reaching, more contained. Because when emotional loneliness becomes a repeated experience, connection starts to feel like something they are always maintaining alone. And eventually, that kind of loneliness does not just hurt them. It teaches them to step back from places where their emotional presence is never fully returned. There is a moment in every empath's journey where silence stops being a reaction and becomes a decision. For so long, they are conditioned to speak, to explain, to smooth things over, to make sure everyone else feels okay even when they are not. Their instinct is to maintain peace even at the cost of their own emotional weight. They carry conversations that drain them. They absorb emotions that were never theirs to begin with. They hold space for others while quietly abandoning their own needs in the process. And for a long time, that feels normal to them. It feels like love. It feels like responsibility. It feels like who they are meant to be. But eventually, something shifts. Silence enters not as avoidance, but as protection. A boundary that does not need to be explained to be valid. For the first time, they begin to recognize that constant emotional availability does not always equal connection. Sometimes it only equals depletion, and so they stop speaking in moments where they once would have over-explained. They stop stepping into conversations that only lead to emotional exhaustion. They stop carrying the weight of fixing what was never theirs to fix. This silence is not cold. It is not distant. It is deeply intentional. It is the first time they choose their own emotional space over the expectation of others. And even though it may look like withdrawal, internally it feels like relief. Because for an empath, silence is not emptiness, it is space. Space to breathe without responsibility. Space to exist without emotional pressure. Space to finally feel what they have been ignoring for so long. And in that space, something powerful begins to form. A quiet strength that does not need validation. A calm that does not depend on external understanding. A version of themselves that is no longer surviving through constant emotional giving, but slowly learning what it means to protect their own energy without apology. People often mistake an empath's quietness for something temporary, as if distance is just a phase they will eventually outgrow. But what is not always understood is how much emotional weight it takes to reach that point in the first place. Detachment is never the beginning. It is the end of a long internal process that no one else gets to witness. When an empath truly detaches, it does not come from anger or impulsive decisions. It comes from accumulated clarity, from repeated emotional exhaustion, from finally seeing that certain patterns do not change no matter how much effort is given. And once that clarity settles in, something permanent shifts inside them. They do not return to connections in the same way they once did. Even if they are physically present again, the emotional access is no longer automatic. The openness that once defined them becomes carefully guarded, not because they have become cold, but because they have learned what it costs to stay open in the wrong spaces. This version of them carries a different kind of strength. A quiet awareness that not every emotional connection deserves full access. Not every situation deserves explanation. Not every person deserves repeated emotional entry points into their inner world. And because of that, they become harder to influence in the ways they once were. Emotional manipulation loses its grip when someone has already seen the full cycle play out too many times. They no longer react from hope. They respond from experience. Even their kindness begins to change shape. It is no longer automatic. It becomes intentional, measured, protected. Because once an empath has fully detached, they are not trying to prove anything anymore. They are simply committed to not returning to the version of themselves that stayed too long in places where their presence was never fully valued. The most unsettling part of an empath's silence is not what it contains, but what it no longer contains. There is no anger driving it, no desire to punish, no need to prove a point. What replaces all of that is something far quieter and far more final. Acceptance. They reach a place where they no longer feel the need to chase understanding from people who were never willing to truly see them. They stop arguing in circles that lead nowhere. They stop trying to translate their emotions into words that keep getting overlooked. And most importantly, they stop trying to hold together something that required only one person to sustain. The energy that once went into saving the connection begins to dissolve. Not suddenly, but completely. The emotional effort that used to be poured into fixing, explaining, and hoping starts to disappear. And in its place there is stillness, a calm that does not ask for anything in return. From the outside, this silence can feel confusing, even uncomfortable, because it carries no clear signal of anger or sadness. It simply removes presence where there used to be emotional engagement. Conversations lose depth. Reactions lose urgency, and slowly, even attention fades. For the other person, this is often the moment realization finally arrives. Not during the arguments, not during the explanations, but when nothing they say or do creates a response anymore. When the emotional feedback loop that once existed is completely gone, and in that absence, the weight of what has been lost becomes clear. Because an empath's silence is not loud, but it is absolute. It does not demand attention, it simply withdraws it. And once that withdrawal is complete, it often reveals just how much emotional presence was taken for granted all along. When an empath goes quiet, it is never just a moment. It is a process that has been unfolding for a long time in places no one else could see. It is the result of accumulated pain, unheard feelings, emotional exhaustion, and too many moments where their heart kept giving long after it should have stopped. Empaths do not suddenly stop caring. That is not how they are built. They care deeply, often beyond reason, often beyond their own limits. But there comes a point where caring no longer feels like connection. It starts to feel like loss. Like silence would hurt less than continuing to be misunderstood. And so they change, quietly. Not in anger, but in awareness. They reach a moment where protecting themselves becomes more important than proving themselves, where peace becomes more valuable than explanation, where silence becomes the only space left where their heart can breathe again. And maybe the most painful truth of all is this: the loudest heartbreaks are not always spoken. Sometimes they are not even seen. Sometimes they arrive without confrontation, without closure, without warning. Just a gentle fading of presence until all that remains is absence. Sometimes the deepest goodbye arrives in complete silence. If this video resonated with you, take a moment to like and subscribe to Empath Energy. Your support helps bring more awareness to the silent emotional worlds many people live in but rarely express. And as you move forward, remember this: a kind heart can heal from almost anything, but it should never have to disappear in order to be valued.